Welcome back to the Deep 404. There's bad news for the Ukrainians in Avdiivka. Over the last couple of weeks, the fighting has started to turn towards the Russians. The news over the last 2 days has been conclusively in the Russian favour. The area of Avdiivka, which is just to the northwest of Donetsk city, has been a crucial part of the Ukrainian defensive line since 2014, and it is an industrial area in the northern part of Avdiivka, which has been fortified and reinforced since 2014. Avdiivka itself spans about 16 square kilometres. It's not a large area, but the bottom 4/5 of the town are predominantly houses, with the coke plant in the northern area of Avdiivka. What appears to have happened in the last 48 hours is a number of Russian breaches of the outer lying defences of Avdiivka itself. If we just go and have a look here on the map, that's Avdiivka that you can see outlined in the northern area. Up here is the coke plant. This large round area here is the dump, sort of slag and waste heap from the coke facilities. Now, there reportedly has been Ukrainian fortification of the coke plant and around the perimeter of Avdiivka. However, given that most of the area south of the coke plant, this square box at the top, is really residential housing areas, there is not a great deal there that can be reinforced. So there appears to have been an initial perimeter line set up, and that is what the Russians now appear to be breaching. In the south, down in the very south area here, there are now reports of Russian incursions into Avdiivka in this area. There are reports now that in the north, in this area here, between the coke plant and the waste heap, there is a train line running through here, and there is reports that the Russians have even advanced over this railway line and made some reconnaissance maneuvers into the coke plant area. This is all being compounded with reports that commanding AFU, Armed Forces of Ukraine officers, have been evacuated from the city, and further reports that Ukrainian forces from the southern and eastern parts of the city have been retreating back towards the coke plant. The coke plant, I believe it's one of the largest of its type in Europe, I think, and it is a large industrial site. So lots of underground facilities, lots of concrete, and this area itself has been reinforced and fortified reportedly. So the Ukrainian forces retreating back to the coke plant is what you would expect as they become pressured by the Russians. This western side along here is the one area at the moment which isn't actively being attacked, but it appears there are Russian attacks on the northwestern, even on the eastern side here, and certainly around the south. And if I just jump to this other map here, now this is Avdiivka here. There have been Russian advances from Krasnohorivka here to Stepove. Now, Stepove, this township here, reportedly the Russians have pushed the Ukrainians out of this area entirely. However, the Russians aren't occupying Stepove, reason being that there's nothing left there what was there in that small settlement has been leveled effectively, but it is now in the grey zone. It was under Ukrainian control, but now no longer in Ukrainian control, which means that attacks towards Berdichi now are more likely as the Ukrainians are pushed back to Berdichi itself. There is also reporting now that in the last 24 hours, the Russians have moved north and west from Krasnokharivka and have assumed control of the area of land just north of this blue line, around these forested areas south of Novokalynove here. And assuming control around here to this train line as well. So getting even closer to Ocheretino, this township just here. So the Russians are consolidating and solidifying and thickening this northern pincer over Avdeevka. And there have been similar reports of Russians consolidating this southern pincer here around Opotne and Vodyane here. So overall, Avdiivka appears to be in the process of falling to the Russians, with its outer perimeter in the south and east and northern regions having been pierced by the Russians. Reports of the commanding Ukrainian officers being evacuated, and reports of Ukrainian forces retreating back towards the coke plant area. So while the Avdiivka hasn't fallen yet, and the Ukrainians may choose to defend strongly the coke plant area, they do run the very real risk of finding themselves encircled once the Russians take the southern part of Avdiivka, are able to capture all this area in here, effectively closing off from this yellow line to just the south of the coke plant. Then it becomes relatively easy for the Russians then to work around La Stochlene here and to Olivka and completely surround the coke plant, and for those forces that remain in there. There are reports from Ukrainian channels too now confirming this. One of them saying that Russian forces have not halted and are achieving tactical successes. Currently, efforts are focused on delaying them rather than stopping them. Prospects are uncertain due to the balance of forces, resources, and the ongoing operational challenges. After having liberated Stepove north of Avdiivka, the Russian forces have withdrawn from it, and the Ukrainians have not tried to recapture it, both sides realizing that the lack of fortifications in the small village make it a trap for whoever tries to control it without securing the flanks. It is now in the grey zone. Also, the General Staff of the Ukrainian Armed Forces reports that Russian forces conduct assault operations in areas including Keramik, east of Novokalynove, Stepove, Avdiivka, and south of Donetsk, with 17 recorded attacks. This under artillery and mortar fire, Ukrainian positions in over 15 areas, including Alexandropol, Ocheretino, Stepove, Avdiivka, Severne, are also affected. There is an expectation that severe fighting will commence in the coming days as Russians begin assaults against the coke plant itself. There have been reports of Russian losses, some significant Russian losses in some of the areas around Avdiivka. However, there is also footage emerging showing that what appears to be Russian advances with a number of tanks, video footage of them approaching areas of Avdiivka, 5 or 6 tanks in this group, just rolling forwards, not appearing to be taking any return fire as they fire forwards towards an area of Avdiivka. There doesn't appear to be any drone or artillery counter-fire to them. They just appear to be advancing and firing at will. In other areas of the fighting, it's reported that the Russian army has finally managed to take control of the village of Spolnoye to the east of Seversk, which is up north of this area. Russian forces have recaptured Avdiivka. Now, Avdiivka is just south of Bakhmut. We might just on the map here. I'll go back to the map for a moment. A second here. Avdiivka and Klishayevka, south of Bakhmut. Let's just get a map. Here we go. These areas, Klishayevka here, and Avdiivka just here. These were areas which the Ukrainians and Russians have fought over for the last months. The Ukrainians were able to push in Avdiivka, push the Russians back over the rail line. The rail line just runs along this blue line here. And in Klishayevka having similar successes pushing the Russians back. It's reported now that the Russians have recaptured Avdiivka. That Russian reconnaissance groups entered into Avdiivka and found no Ukrainian troops there. It appears as though they have retreated, and that in this last counteroffensive by the Russians, it appears as though the Russians have retaken Avdiivka without losses. It's currently putting Avdiivka back into the grey zone. Unlikely that the Russians will necessarily try to hold it, but they have been able to get into there and found no Ukrainian forces in Avdiivka, so it appears they have retreated. Klishayevka also reports that the Russians have been successful in that area. Also in the town of Bogdanovka, west of Artyomsk or Bakhmut. It's reported that Russians have reached the outskirts of Bogdanovka, and that in the coming hours or days that they will perform an assault on Bogdanovka. So there are reports in a number of areas in this Donetsk area where the Russians are having success in their offensive against Ukrainian positions, and in some cases Ukrainian positions that have been held for a long period of time. In Avdiivka, Avdiivka has been held by the Ukrainians since 2014, so for them to lose Avdiivka, which appears to be imminent, if not within the next days, perhaps within the next weeks, that will be a significant loss to the Ukrainian forces in this area, and seen as a significant win for the Russian forces and the people, the civilian population of Donetsk city. Avdiivka reportedly has been one of the primary locations that has been involved in the ongoing shelling of civilians in Donetsk during this sort of 8 or 9 year long conflict since 2014 now. So a lot of support in Donetsk for the Russian capture of Avdiivka, so that shelling of Donetsk will be reduced. It's just on a side note on that, there's been a lot of talk recently of the number of civilian casualties in Gaza and the Israeli conflict with Hamas in Gaza, as compared to the number of civilian casualties in the Ukrainian-Russian conflict. The number of civilian casualties in the Ukrainian conflict is somewhere around the 14,000 mark. Now, interestingly, what has been said in a lot of Western media has been that the Israelis have managed to kill Palestinian civilians to the number of about 11,000 in a 6-week period, which compares to the number of civilian casualties killed in Russia killed in Ukraine in this almost year and a half period. What has been interesting has been that in those comments, it has rarely been made clear that the bulk of those civilians killed have been civilians killed by Ukrainian shelling. It's sort of used in this information seems to be used in a weird, almost hypocritical way, where it's used to say, in one respect, that the Israelis have been killing more civilians in a short period of time than have been killed in this conflict, to contrast it, but it hasn't then been cleared out that the bulk of those who have been killed in the conflict have been killed by Ukraine and not by Russia. Interesting use of data. Foreign Affairs magazine, showing now, again, how things are just getting worse for Ukraine. Foreign Affairs has an article, A New Definition of Success in Ukraine. And they talk about the fact that Kiev is offered to sit down at the negotiating table with Russia and admit that the military objectives of the armed forces of Ukraine are unattainable. The failure of the counteroffensive, the weakening of support from the United States and Europe, the onset of cold weather, all this requires a comprehensive reassessment of the current strategy of Ukraine and its partners. The United States should begin consultations with Ukraine and its European partners on a strategy based on Ukraine's willingness to negotiate peace with Russia and simultaneously switch from attack to defence. Ukraine and the West are still moving along a shaky trajectory due to the blatant discrepancy between the goals and the available means to achieve them. The continuation of the strategy of supplying weapons and equipment is an expensive dead end, since there is no silver bullet capable of changing the course of events on the battlefield. And reportedly, this was also recognised by the Commander-in-Chief of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, Valery Zaluzhny. So this is showing now how in the West the feeling of what is happening in Ukraine is changing, how support is dropping off for Ukraine. A few months back, we spoke about there were hints that the timeline was December, and that if success wasn't shown in Ukraine by December, that support would drop off. We've certainly seen that already happening. Funding for Ukraine is falling. The supply of military equipment is declining across NATO and European nations. And now there is this talk and recognition from Zaluzhny, the Commander-in-Chief of the Ukraine Armed Forces, that they can't achieve their goals. This is pushing towards a situation where Ukraine will be forced to negotiate with Russia. However, Russia may not be in the mood to give anything in the negotiations. Any negotiations at this stage would be ones which were led by Russia, and the demands of Russia would be required to be met by Ukraine in order for there to be a conclusion to the negotiations or a achievement of a ceasefire or peace. The Ukrainian counteroffensive was aimed to reach the Sea of Azov, cut off Crimea, and give the Ukrainians a bargaining chip, something they could take into negotiations and be able to perhaps trade something for. With the failure to achieve that, the Ukrainians are left with nothing to bargain with. They are in the unfortunate position of effectively not negotiating, but needing to admit defeat. That's the position that many in the West are now recognising. Perhaps the best thing that could happen now would be for Ukraine to change leadership to someone who was able to recognise the position they were in and look for a peace deal with Russia as rapidly as possible. That may then, for Ukraine, give them the opportunity to save Odessa, keep Odessa as part of Ukraine, keep that port access, which Odessa gives Ukraine, which would be invaluable. If this continues much longer, then it's entirely likely that the Russians will drive towards Zaporozhye, through Kherson, and ultimately to Odessa, taking Odessa and removing all port access for what remains of Ukraine, leaving Ukraine as a landlocked rump state. This should be the highest priority for Ukraine at the moment, to find an end to this conflict, and one which sees them retaining Odessa, their ability to be able to ship grain and products via the Black Sea. If they lose that, then strategically they lose so much more than if they were to negotiate a peace now and retain Odessa. So Odessa, I think, is becoming the key concern for Ukraine. I mean, there's a lot else going on. There are reports just today of Geranium drones, Russian drones striking Kiev, reaching Kiev. There has been report of a senior flight commander of the Ukrainian Air Forces who has defected to Russia, taking with him his Su27 aircraft. I'm not able to corroborate this yet, but there appears to be reporting of this happening over the last 12 hours or so, and an indication that this Ukrainian pilot may have been in negotiation with Russia for some period of time. We'll see if this is true, and we'll see if he has defected with his Su27. Obviously, something like that makes then the likelihood of the Ukraine receiving F-16s far less likely, as any nation who's giving F-16s to Ukraine would want guarantees that there is no way that they would fall into Russian hands. Now, given this example of a senior flight commander defecting to Russia and taking his Su-27, if this has happened, that opens the risk that a similar thing might happen with an F-16. And that would be considered a complete failure, a disaster for the West and for the US if the Russians were able to get their hands on an active flying F-16 and be able to then use that to train up their air defense capabilities. There are also reports now of Russia stockpiling missiles and preparing them to be able to attack the Ukrainian energy infrastructure as the winter approaches. Again, this may occur so as to put enough internal pressure on the Zelensky leadership of Ukraine that they effectively capitulate and ask to negotiate with the Russians to find a way to save the general population of Ukraine from going through even a harder winter than last winter, one where the Russians used tactical missile strikes across the country to effectively turn the power off to Ukraine. There are reports of rallies within Ukraine now demanding a demobilization. Internally, it appears that people within Ukraine are feeling that enough is enough, that they themselves recognize that they are losing, that they are not going to win against Russia in this conflict, that they have lost the support of the West, and that right now, by continuing and mobilizing, all they are doing is killing their men. Even France has declared its readiness for an effective and useful dialogue with Russia. Germany's Olaf Scholz has announced that he is willing to prepare to talk with Russia. So we're seeing signs now from NATO leaders that they are willing to talk And part of this will be induced by the need for the US to want to step out of this conflict, focus their attention on the Middle East, which has the possibility of being a far larger and more all-consuming conflict, and one which risks for the US a larger loss. The loss of Ukraine to the US is not of great concern to the US. As harsh as that sounds, that's the reality of the situation. The US has used Ukraine like a pawn in this conflict against Russia, one which failed, but has, as John Mearsheimer said, has wrecked Ukraine. The US are more concerned about Israel and the risk of them losing Israel. If that escalates, that conflict there, and the Arab and Muslim nations unite and decide to attack Israel, then the US is drawn into that conflict, and that's where their focus needs to be. Otherwise, they run the risk of Israel being destroyed and them losing that what Israel gives them, that point of power projection into the Middle East. But that's another topic which I might come back to later. I think just a bit of a wrap up on Avdiivka. The coming days, I think we will see further and further Russian advances up through the township, through the housing areas, or the Dhaka areas, until ultimately all pressure is focused on the coke plant. And then we will see if the Ukrainians have made the decision that enough is enough and that they will abandon the coke plant and the Russians will take it without much of a fight, or if they will stand and look to defend the coke plant, even as the likelihood of them being surrounded increases. Personally, I hope that the Ukrainians will make the decision to move out of the coke plant, just so that they aren't all of those soldiers destroyed in there, for the sake of retaining a coke plant facility which is going to be wrecked in the next few days anyhow. All right, that's it for today. I hope you're having a good weekend. I'll talk to you soon.